Hello, everyone, and welcome back. Today, we're exploring a truth that many people spend years resisting. We often believe that if we explain ourselves clearly enough, defend our intentions carefully enough, and prove our hearts honestly enough, people will finally understand us. But life has a way of revealing something far more complex. The journey toward self-awareness often requires letting go of the need to be understood by everyone. And once that realization arrives, it changes the way you see relationships, growth, and yourself. Most people waste years trying to be understood. They explain themselves endlessly. They justify their decisions, defend their motives, and clarify every silence, every change, every choice. Deep down, they believe that if others could simply see the real version of them, everything would finally feel peaceful. Yet something unexpected often happens. The more you explain yourself, the more people feel entitled to evaluate, question, and define you. The reality is that people rarely see you as you truly are. More often, they see you through the lens of their own experiences, fears, expectations, and emotional needs. Once you understand this, a quiet shift begins inside you. You slowly release the exhausting need to be perfectly perceived, because perception is rarely objective. Most people create an internal version of you that helps them feel comfortable. They want you to remain familiar, predictable, and easy to categorize. The moment you begin growing beyond the role they assign to you, discomfort quietly emerges. You may first notice it when you strengthen your boundaries, when you become less available, less reactive, and less dependent on approval. Suddenly, people who once admired your kindness start calling you distant. People who benefited from your uncertainty begin labeling your confidence as arrogance. And this is where many individuals abandon themselves, not because they lack strength, but because they struggle to tolerate being misunderstood. So they return to old patterns. They soften their opinions. They apologize for their growth. They over-explain choices that never required explanation, all in an attempt to restore harmony with people who were only comfortable with a smaller version of them. What many fail to realize is that people often become emotionally attached to the identity they assign to you. When you outgrow that identity, it can feel like a personal betrayal to them, even when your transformation is necessary. Even when it saves your life. There is an invisible agreement hidden inside many relationships. It is rarely spoken aloud, yet it influences countless interactions. The agreement quietly says, "I will remain comfortable with you as long as you remain who I expect you to be." The moment you break that expectation, reactions begin to surface. Some people become passive-aggressive. Some withdraw warmth and affection. Some begin questioning your intentions. Others quietly hope your new path fails, not necessarily because they dislike you, but because your growth forces them to confront areas of their own lives they would rather avoid. Many people protect their self-image at all costs. Facing unconscious envy or unresolved dissatisfaction is far more difficult than criticizing someone else's transformation. This is why becoming mentally stronger can sometimes feel surprisingly lonely. You start realizing that many relationships were not built on genuine understanding. They were built on familiar roles: the agreeable friend, the forgiving partner, the insecure child, the self-sacrificing helper. Every social system creates expectations, and the system becomes unstable the moment one person refuses to continue performing their assigned role. That is why some people seem uncomfortable when you begin healing. Your struggles may have benefited them more than either of you realized. Someone who constantly doubts themselves is easier to influence. Someone desperate for validation is easier to manipulate. Someone terrified of rejection is easier to keep compliant. But self-awareness changes everything. Once awareness enters the mind, automatic obedience begins to disappear. And people often sense that shift long before you ever mention it. They notice it in your silence, in your posture, in the calmness that appears when you no longer feel compelled to prove who you are. That calm can be deeply unsettling to those who rely on emotional reactions, because people who depend on control often survive through your response. When they can no longer pull you into guilt, fear, or endless justification, they begin losing access to you. And psychological access is a form of power. There comes a stage in personal growth where conversations start looking different. Not merely sounding different, but revealing entirely new layers. You begin noticing how rarely communication is purely about understanding. Much of it is negotiation, positioning, emotional self-protection disguised as honesty. Someone asks how you are, but what they truly seek is reassurance that nothing has changed. A friend offers advice, but beneath it may be anxiety that your growth will create distance. Someone criticizes your ambition, your boundaries, or your silence, and you suddenly realize they are not responding to your behavior itself. They are responding to the loss of influence they once had over your identity. Once you see these patterns, they become difficult to ignore. You notice the colleague who turns everything into a joke whenever you speak with confidence, the relative who only praises you when you remain uncertain about yourself, the partner who misses the old you the moment you stop accepting disrespect. At first, these observations feel uncomfortable. Then they feel heartbreaking. Eventually, they begin to feel obvious. Human beings are driven by more than conscious thought. They are often guided by unconscious needs they barely recognize within themselves. One of the strongest is the need for familiarity. People feel safe when they think they know exactly who you are, not necessarily the real you, but the predictable version of you. That is why authenticity sometimes creates discomfort rather than connection. The more authentic you become, the more difficult you are to control. And control exists within many relationships, sometimes subtly, sometimes unconsciously. A parent may use guilt, a friend may use loyalty, a partner may use emotional distance, a group may use shame. Most people never recognize these dynamics because they remain focused on being accepted. But when approval stops being your primary goal, a new reality begins to reveal itself. You start seeing how many relationships contained hidden conditions from the beginning. Respect that depended on performance, affection that depended on usefulness, attention that depended on emotional availability. Very little proves completely unconditional. And perhaps the deepest realization is this: many people do not actually seek truth. They seek comfort. Truth often requires change. Change demands responsibility. Responsibility forces self-examination. And self-examination can be painful. That is why personal growth sometimes triggers resistance in others. Not because your progress harms them, but because it reflects possibilities they have chosen to avoid. Your discipline highlights their excuses. Your self-respect highlights their self-neglect. Your emotional stability highlights their impulsiveness. People rarely resent your weaknesses. More often, they resent the possibility that you may eventually outgrow the limitations they accepted for themselves. And that resentment rarely arrives openly. Instead, it appears in subtle forms. Less excitement for your victories, less encouragement when you succeed, more criticism when you change, more distance when you become stronger. The lesson is not to become cynical. The lesson is to become aware. Not everyone will understand your evolution. Not everyone will celebrate your healing. Not everyone will recognize the person you are becoming. And that is perfectly acceptable. Your responsibility is not to manage every perception. Your responsibility is to remain honest with yourself. The moment you stop chasing universal approval, something remarkable happens. You recover energy that was once wasted on explanations. You reclaim parts of yourself that were sacrificed for acceptance, and you discover a form of peace that does not depend on being understood. Because true freedom begins when you no longer need everyone to agree with your transformation in order to continue becoming who you were meant to be. As you continue growing, certain patterns become impossible to ignore. People often become more comfortable with your failures than with your success. Small dismissive remarks begin appearing disguised as humor. Emotional warmth quietly fades the moment your confidence starts increasing. Human nature reveals itself most clearly when you no longer depend on others for validation. That is often when you discover who values your presence and who values your dependence. This is one reason psychologically aware individuals tend to become quieter over time. It is not because they have nothing to say. It is because they eventually recognize how exhausting it is to constantly explain themselves to people who have already decided how they want to interpret them. At a certain point, silence becomes an act of self-respect. Not every accusation deserves a response. Not every misunderstanding requires correction. Not every opinion deserves unrestricted access to your emotional energy. Some people remain committed to misunderstanding you because your reality challenges the story they tell themselves, and no amount of explanation can heal someone who benefits from seeing you incorrectly. What makes this realization painful is not the betrayal itself. It is when it arrives. It often appears at the exact moment you begin becoming stronger, when your thinking becomes clearer, when your confidence is no longer dependent on applause, when you finally stop abandoning yourself in order to be accepted. That is when resistance begins to emerge. At first, the resistance feels confusing because it often comes from people who claim to care about you. But caring about someone and being comfortable with their growth are not always the same thing. Some people care deeply about you as long as your existence does not disrupt their emotional equilibrium. The moment your growth creates discomfort, hidden conditions begin revealing themselves. Affection becomes conditional, support becomes selective, understanding becomes limited. This is why transformation can feel lonely. You are not simply leaving old habits behind. You are also leaving behind the invisible agreements that once kept certain relationships stable. The version of you that tolerated disrespect made some people comfortable. The version of you that doubted yourself allowed others to feel superior. The version of you that constantly explained yourself gave certain people emotional influence over your life. But once awareness develops, these dynamics become impossible to ignore. Gradually, your behavior changes. You stop arguing endlessly. You stop chasing closure from people unwilling to provide it. You stop forcing others to understand your intentions. Because eventually, you recognize a difficult truth. People often interpret you according to their psychological needs rather than your actual character. An untrustworthy person suspects dishonesty everywhere. An insecure person mistakes confidence for arrogance. A controlling person interprets boundaries as rejection. Many judgments are projections disguised as perception. What people refuse to acknowledge within themselves often becomes what they criticize most aggressively in others. Suddenly, countless interactions begin making sense. The person constantly accusing others of selfishness may be deeply self-focused. The individual obsessed with criticizing attention-seeking may secretly crave attention themselves. The person uncomfortable around confidence may be quietly struggling with feelings of inadequacy. Human beings rarely react to reality alone. They react to what reality awakens inside them. That is why two people can encounter the same individual and walk away with entirely different impressions. One sees confidence while another sees intimidation. One sees calmness while another sees emotional distance. One sees authenticity while another sees rebellion. People are not merely responding to you, they are responding to their own experiences, fears, insecurities, and unresolved wounds. And wounds distort perception. This is why attempting to control how everyone sees you eventually becomes psychologically exhausting. You begin performing instead of living. You adjust your personality for every audience. You soften your opinions to avoid rejection. You wear different masks depending on who is watching. And after enough years, you begin forgetting which version is truly yours. That is the hidden cost of needing universal approval. It slowly disconnects you from your own identity. Many people spend decades trapped in that cycle, smiling in environments they secretly dislike, agreeing with opinions they do not believe, suppressing thoughts that might disturb social harmony. Because for many, social rejection feels more frightening than self-betrayal. Yet eventually, there comes a moment when awareness becomes too strong to ignore. You realize that peace was never going to come from being understood by everyone. Peace begins the moment you stop abandoning yourself in order to remain acceptable. Without healthy boundaries, kindness often becomes permission for others to take advantage of you, and those who benefited from your lack of boundaries may label your healing as selfishness, not because you became cruel, but because you became more difficult to manipulate. The unsettling reality is that manipulation rarely arrives looking harmful. Often it arrives disguised as concern, disguised as advice, disguised as protection, disguised as love. That is why so many people remain trapped inside unhealthy dynamics without recognizing them. Psychological control works most effectively when it feels justified. Someone claims they are only worried about you, yet every step toward independence disappoints them. Someone insists they care deeply, yet your world slowly becomes smaller and more restricted. Someone says you have changed, but what they truly mean is that you no longer behave in ways that benefit them. Human beings possess a remarkable ability to disguise self-interest as moral concern, even from themselves. The ego works tirelessly to preserve a positive self-image. Few people see themselves clearly, and those who begin seeing honestly often become uncomfortable with what they observe. Because beneath the surface, much of social life is sustained by unconscious performance. People laugh to belong, agree to survive, apologize to avoid abandonment, ignore disrespect to preserve connection. Much of social harmony is maintained through subtle forms of dishonesty so common that they appear normal. Someone claims to value honesty but punishes vulnerability. Someone praises authenticity but withdraws when uncomfortable truths emerge. Friends speak of loyalty while quietly competing beneath the surface. Behind polished manners and social etiquette, ancient human instincts still operate. Status, validation, control, fear, recognition, belonging. These forces continue shaping behavior more than most people realize. That is why emotionally aware individuals often feel drained in groups. They notice the invisible tensions beneath conversations, the subtle competitions, the quiet power struggles, the endless search for validation. One person dominates discussion to establish authority. Another hides insecurity behind humor. Another performs indifference to appear superior. Another agrees with everyone because rejection terrifies them. Many people are acting without realizing they are acting. And once you recognize it, everyday interactions can begin feeling strangely theatrical. However, awareness should not lead to cynicism. Seeing darkness within human nature is not the same as rising above it. In fact, some of the most dangerous people are those who believe they are completely free from manipulation, while remaining controlled by unconscious desires. What remains hidden does not disappear. It simply finds another way to express itself. Suppressed anger becomes passive aggression. Denied envy becomes quiet resentment. Hidden insecurity becomes a desperate need for validation. The unconscious always finds a path to the surface. That is why self-awareness can be uncomfortable. It requires facing the parts of yourself you would rather avoid. The ego, the jealousy, the desire for superiority, the need to be admired, the temptation to control how others perceive you. Because the truth is that you are not merely surrounded by unconscious behavior. You are capable of it as well. And this realization changes everything. You stop dividing humanity into good people and bad people. Instead, you begin seeing frightened people, wounded people, confused people, unaware people, including yourself. Perhaps the most dangerous illusion is believing that good intentions automatically make someone innocent. Many people cause harm while sincerely believing they are doing the right thing. Real psychological growth begins when you stop looking exclusively at the darkness in others and start recognizing it within yourself. The subtle desire to be admired, the quiet satisfaction that comes from feeling needed, the temptation to appear unaffected while hurting deeply, the urge to make others regret losing you. These tendencies exist in far more people than anyone likes to admit. The qualities we reject within ourselves do not vanish. They move into the shadows of the mind and influence behavior from behind the scenes, and society often rewards these hidden patterns. Manipulative individuals can appear charismatic. Emotionally detached individuals can appear powerful. Ruthless individuals can appear confident. Meanwhile, authenticity is sometimes mistaken for weakness simply because it has become so uncommon. This leads to a difficult realization. Many social systems reward appearance more than psychological health. They reward confidence more than self-awareness, performance more than authenticity, status more than inner stability. As a result, many admired people privately feel empty. Their entire identity becomes a carefully maintained performance, and eventually they forget how to remove the mask. You can see it everywhere. The successful professional whose private life is quietly collapsing, the public advocate of self-love who remains dependent on validation, the seemingly strong individual who falls apart in solitude. Modern life often encourages people to manage appearances instead of understanding themselves. But false identities require constant maintenance. A single criticism can threaten them. A single rejection can expose them. A single failure can destabilize everything. This is why people become defensive so quickly. Often, you are not challenging their opinion. You are challenging the identity built around that opinion. And fragile identities rarely welcome truth. They respond with anger, mockery, withdrawal, avoidance. Because avoidance remains one of humanity's most common defenses. People avoid difficult conversations, avoid self-examination, avoid uncomfortable truths, avoid confronting contradictions. Distraction becomes the solution. Noise, entertainment, validation, constant stimulation, anything that prevents silence, anything that prevents reflection. Yet life eventually removes distractions. Heartbreak, failure, loneliness, loss. Suffering has a way of stripping away performance, and beneath every carefully constructed identity, the authentic self remains waiting, unresolved, unknown, often frightened, but real. Most relationships do not collapse simply because people change. They collapse because the masks can no longer survive, and when those masks finally fall away, people encounter one another honestly for the very first time. Sometimes that creates distance, and sometimes, for the first time, it creates genuine connection. More often than not, growth creates distance because many people are attached to the idea of who they thought you were rather than who you actually are. Truth has a lonely quality to it. It removes comforting illusions faster than the heart can replace them. Over time, something inside a person changes, not visibly, but internally. You stop assuming that attention means care, that closeness means loyalty, or that kindness is always genuine. Experience teaches a difficult lesson. People are often most affectionate when they fear losing access to you. Once they feel secure in your attachment, effort fades, respect weakens, and appreciation disappears. This is why emotionally strong people often become more reserved, not because they feel less, but because they understand the cost of giving unrestricted emotional access to those who never earned it. The moment you stop performing, certain relationships begin falling apart naturally. Some friends disappear when you stop entertaining them. Some people grow distant when you stop sacrificing yourself for their comfort. What first feels like loss eventually reveals something deeper. Many people were attached to the version of you that benefited them, not the person you truly are. Once you recognize this, you stop negotiating your identity for acceptance. You stop shrinking yourself to make others comfortable. You stop apologizing for needing peace, boundaries, or solitude. A quiet calm begins to emerge, the kind that appears when you no longer fear being misunderstood. Most people hide parts of themselves because they fear rejection more than self-betrayal. They become different people in different environments, wearing masks so often that they lose touch with who they really are. But living through masks eventually creates anxiety, confusion, and emptiness. The mind was never meant to remain disconnected from its authentic self for long. That is why solitude can be transformative. In silence, performance disappears. Without distraction, you begin confronting your fears, insecurities, loneliness, and hidden motivations. You realize how much of your personality was shaped by approval, validation, and the desire to belong. These realizations are uncomfortable, but they are also liberating. Awareness breaks unconscious patterns. An aware person is harder to manipulate, harder to control, and less willing to accept counterfeit connection. And counterfeit connection is everywhere. Relationships maintained out of convenience. Conversations filled with words but empty of honesty. People surrounded by others yet feeling completely unseen. Loneliness is not always the absence of people. Sometimes it is the absence of authenticity. Many individuals spend years being accepted for a version of themselves that is not real. They become socially successful, but emotionally invisible. Their lives are full of access, but empty of genuine connection. Real connection is rare because it requires truth, and truth makes people vulnerable. Most people reveal themselves in carefully measured amounts, afraid that complete honesty might cost them acceptance. The deeper you observe human behavior, the more you realize that fear quietly drives much of it. Fear of abandonment, fear of inadequacy, fear of irrelevance. Even ambition, confidence, and success can sometimes be attempts to escape those fears. What matters is not only what people do, but why they do it. Two people can behave identically while acting from completely different motives. One gives out of generosity. Another gives to gain control. One remains silent out of wisdom. Another remains silent out of fear. This is why understanding people takes time. Human behavior is influenced by layers of unconscious beliefs, unmet needs, hidden fears, and emotional conditioning that even people themselves rarely understand. Real maturity begins when a person stops asking only who hurt them and starts asking what patterns inside them continue recreating the same suffering. That question changes everything. Self-awareness is expensive. It costs comfort. It costs ego. Sometimes it costs entire identities. But without it, people remain trapped in the same cycles, repeating the same mistakes while blaming different circumstances. Eventually, awareness reaches a point where it becomes impossible to return to unconscious living. You begin seeing the same emotional patterns repeated through different people, the same insecurities hidden behind different personalities, and the same emptiness beneath different forms of success. For a time, this can make the world feel colder. You stop romanticizing people. You stop trusting words without observing actions, because actions reveal truth far more reliably than promises. Many relationships are built less on genuine connection and more on emotional need, validation, security, attention, status, or distraction from loneliness. Remove the benefit, and some relationships quietly collapse. But awareness is not bitterness. Bitterness judges human nature. Awareness simply observes it. It allows you to stop expecting permanence from temporary people, depth from those unwilling to reflect, and emotional maturity from those who have never confronted themselves honestly. Many heartbreaks become transformative because they destroy illusions. You realize you were attached not only to a person, but to an imagined future, imagined loyalty, and imagined understanding. When those fantasies collapse, something inside you changes permanently. You begin seeing how much of human behavior is shaped by conditioning, fear, and unconscious habits, rather than conscious choice. And once you truly recognize those patterns, you can never see the world in quite the same way again. Awareness does not make life easier, but it makes life clearer, and clarity changes the way you move through the world forever.